Welcome to Rooting for You, a seasonal gardening podcast for non-experts. I'm Tess, and I know nothing.
And I'm Alyce, and I know some things.
Each week we'll chat about one gardening topic and then discuss the effort-reward payoff by asking, is the juice worth the squeeze? Just a heads up, there might be a bit of swearing in this episode. You've been warned. So Alyce suggested we do an episode on composting, looking at worm farms or compost, how to choose, what factors to consider, and I chimed in with, sure, fantastic, great. We can also ask why to compost, and she laughed, which pretty much tells you that I know nothing about composting except that Alyce says we have to do it. So I'm going to start with the basic questions. Alyce, tell me, why do we compost?
Brilliant question, Tess, because I didn't even occur to me that we would answer this question, because to me composting is so fundamental to the garden. Creating compost and adding it to your garden is literally one of the best things you can do for healthy plants. Compost is food for plants. It improves the soil structure. It provides food for the soil microbes, bacteria, fungi, worms. It helps suppress diseases. You're going to have bigger plants. You're going to have better plants. And if you're growing things, fruit, veggies, flowers, bigger, better plants mean bigger, better yields, better produce. So that is what we are all about. In the last episode, you may remember, I talked about feeding your soil and replenishing it in autumn once you've ripped out all your summer crops before you put in your winter crops. Well, one of the best ways to do that is with your homemade compost. This is the time where you'd scoop it out of the compost bin, put it on those garden beds. And the other thing with compost is it actually helps your soil by adding it to your soil. It helps the soil retain moisture, which actually means when you water your garden, you need less water. And you need to water it less often. Now you can buy compost, and honestly, if you've got a really big garden, you probably will need to, because you're not going to be able to make as much compost as what you're going to need. But at the same time, whatever you can produce yourself, absolutely do it. And it's free. And it helps the environment at the same time. And actually, like everything, the compost you produce at home made via traditional methods is just going to be so far superior to the stuff you can buy, which is being composted with modern industrial methods, often a lot faster, often without bacteria and fungi. Now, I don't want you to worry about that. Like, if you have to buy compost, you have to buy compost. But at the same time, when we can do it so easily at home, why wouldn't we? And in this episode, I will tell you exactly how to do it. So firstly, there's a lot of waste we produce in our house, in our kitchen especially. We have two choices with that. We can send it to landfill or we can compost it. In the case of sending it to landfill, we are then sending it to be waste effectively that's not going to be composted and broken down, that's going to rot. It's going to create carbon dioxide. It's going to contribute to global warming, and it's going to ruin everything. Okay? That's the first decision we can make. The second decision we can make is to compost it at home ourselves and actually create food for your garden as well as saving the earth. So, I mean, if that is not the ultimate
Win-win. It sounds like an absolute win-win.
Like, you know, it's a win for the world, but then it's also selfishly a win for you, because your plants are going to be so much stronger, and it's free. So instead of going out and buying compost or buying fertilizers for your garden, you've made a free food. So I think the reason I say it's so fundamental is I think it's a no-brainer to do it. And I think the reason a lot of people don't do it is, one, because they don't understand it, but secondly, if you don't have a garden or you're not involved in gardening, producing compost doesn't seem that valuable. Even though, frankly, I still think, even if you never used it, the fact that it's been composted rather than being sent to landfill is a benefit. When we're growing plants, like, this stuff is gold. So turn that waste, that household waste, that kitchen waste,
into something useful and rewarding for your garden.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about food scraps here. It's things like newspapers, toilet roll, you know, that cardboardy bit in the middle, your egg cartons, flowers, like, you know, you've been given a bunch of flowers as a gift. Once they die,
Letters. bills.
Exactly. Yeah. Your tax
Your
statement,
electricity
whatever.
bill.
Yeah. Get it all in the compost. So when you think about the amount of waste you're producing, once you start composting, and I know this from personal experience, the amount of landfill, like what goes into your rubbish bin each week, is actually really small between, things that can be composted, things that can be recycled. What's left for landfill is minimal.
You've sold us. We're composting.
Fabulous. Job done.
So now, how do we decide between, is it compost or worm farm? Are those our two options?
Well, there are a huge amount of options actually, but what I really want people to think about first off is that composting is not something that gardeners have invented. Composting is something that occurs in nature all the time and has done since the creation of Earth, right? You're in a forest, the leaves fall, plants die, they break down, animals die on the floor of the earth. These things are actually composting, breaking down, and then contribute to feed new plants on the forest floor. So that process of turning dead and waste into food, totally natural. Nature does it for you. And the reason I want people to get that is because we can buy fancy units or set up fancy composting structures that actually do make our lives easier and are easy to use, but fundamentally at its core, you don't actually need anything to compost. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like we've been sold on you need to have all the gear.
Yeah.
But maybe you don't need all the gear.
Well, I think the gear makes it easier. I have the gear, but I just want people to think, even if you spent no money and you invested in nothing, you can make a pile on the ground in your garden and that will compost. So what is compost? Would you have a definition? And I'm really putting you on the spot. Would you feel like you know what compost is?
From what I know about people in my life who I've seen composting, and I am at this very point in my life of I'm deciding how I'm going to be composting my food waste. What I've seen is that you collect it in the kitchen and then you throw it into some kind of receptacle.
Yeah.
That's all I know about it.
Yep. Fair. So
Basic.
So what composting is the transformation of matter by tiny soil microbes, worms, and insects. Because you think about like when you buy celery, right? You chop off the base of the celery, you chop off the top of the celery. That part of the plant has nutrients in it. Of course it does, right? In the same way the middle sticks have nutrients that we eat. Eggshells are another example. They have a huge amount of nutrients in them. When you put them in the bin, those nutrients are lost. They're wasted forever, right? And there's only a finite amount of nutrients on Earth. Like we can't invent this stuff. So, when we take that waste product, it has those nutrients in it, but by composting it, we put it in a form that new plants can access that. Because as a head of celery, or as an eggshell, it's not useful to a plant. But once we've broken it down with the help of insects, worms, microbes, we make it into a form that they can access those nutrients.
Okay.
So the basic fundamentals of composting, and I do think we should do a deep dive into how to really nail it and to go into it in detail. But as an overview, a compost is simply a mix of green matter and brown matter. Green matter is anything that's kind of wet, a banana skin, a potato peel, the top of the celery. Those kind of things are like the green matter, the bunch of flowers that have died. The brown matter is your newspaper, your electricity bill, your toilet roll holder. Those kind of things are the dry brown matter. And we need a mix of both. Because for the microbes to do their composting work and transform this matter, they need food, which is literally the food scraps. They need air. And if it's too wet, there actually isn't air in there and they can't do their work. So we need to add that brown material to give it the air. And they also need moisture. So if it's too dry, it won't compost either. In the same way you see like a big pile of autumn leaves, they're not going to compost in and of themselves.
Yeah, okay.
They're too dry. Or a pile of sticks, for example. So we do need some moisture to give the microbes the moisture they need to break down. And that's things like a banana peel is wet, so that will contribute some moisture. So finding that mix, it sounds complicated. It's actually really easy. Like I don't stand there and think, oh,
you're not testing the moisture.
Yeah, I'm not like, here's my bucket of green and here's my bucket of brown. I just like chuck everything in and, if it's a little bit wet, I'll add some more brown. If it's a little bit dry, I'll add some more green or water it or whatever. But what is important for people before we get into, how we do it is what option there is. Because as you say, there are actually a huge number. The compost bin or the worm farm are kind of the obvious divide, but even within those, there are more options that people can use. So shall I run through a few?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Can I just ask maybe I'm going premature on this question, but I have lived in an apartment. Many of our friends live in an apartment. Does that stop you from composting, or are there options still if you live in an apartment to be able to compost?
There are definitely options for apartment composting.
Okay,
they're
great.
more limited, but they're there. Absolutely.
Fantastic.
And I'm glad you asked, because again, people who live in an apartment, there's no reason for them to be putting all their waste into landfill either.
Yep.
Their options are limited, and they're probably going to be composting a smaller amount, but nonetheless, they can absolutely be composting. And compost is great for houseplants. So,
Fantastic.
It's wins for them too.
Okay, so run us through it.
Okay, types. We have the big scale. This is not for your suburban backyard. This is probably for a little bit more space, is your compost bays. These are 1 meter cubed, kind of usually 3 of them.
And you've got a bit of space, so you have
I
a
have a bit of
compost bay
I have 3 compost bays.
that your chickens love.
My chickens love. There is a whole host of worms and slaters in there that provide a massive amount of protein for my chickens, which I don't have to pay for nor actively tend to. And I feel is a really ethical source of protein for them. So yeah, my compost bays, I love them. Are you going to have compost bays at your house, Tess?
Look,
not a chance.
Probably not. I have no room for anything else except a compost bay.
0 chance of compost bays. But the also thing with compost bays is we've got 3 cubic meters of composting space. You're not going to have 3 cubic meters of stuff to compost, right?
No, of food or garden waste. I
No,
won't.
and of course I don't have 3 cubic meters of food waste, but when it comes to garden waste, I've got plenty of that. So, with thinking about your composting option, the first thing is the space you've got available for a compost, but secondly, how much are you going to be actively composting?
Yeah, so a household of 2 versus a household of 5 would have a different amount of food waste that they're going through every day, for example. And
Exactly. And the size of your garden, the different amount of green waste you're going to have. So the composting bays, it's a really basic way. It's probably how most people do it in bulk. Works really well, but you need the space. Second option, which I'm not saying this is my gold standard of how to do it, but you can literally dig a hole in the ground and put your food scraps in and they will compost.
And there are some worm farms that sit inside your ground. So that's
Yes.
the same theory,
It is.
I guess.
It is.
But digging a hole, no gear required.
No gear required, no expense required. And, say we've talked about how in autumn you've got your bed empty. Theoretically, you could then dig a hole while you've got no plants in it and put your compost in. It's not really workable because you're not going to be digging a hole every couple of days for your compost scraps. But my point is that it's an option for people, and that's probably the most natural way there is to compost.
And I guess the point of that is you don't have to have all the gear, which goes back to your point at the beginning of the conversation, that it happens naturally.
And I think with everything in the garden, you could spend a lot of money on ways to make things easier for you. And frankly, I do, and I love any new garden gadget I am all about. But fundamentally, you don't need to spend money to grow plants. As simple as that. It just might make things easier and possibly more fun.
2 ends of the scale. We've got your 3 cubic meters of bays and we're dug a hole, but what's in between?
We've then got off-ground rotating units. And people have probably seen these things. They're usually like a metal frame. There's a plastic bin, for want of a better word, that sits off the ground that you have some way to rotate, either via like a crank or you can literally spin the thing like a carnival ride. Do you know what I'm talking about?
My neighbour has one, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So these options are really good for backyards like yours, Tess. Like you would be a contender for one of these units. The pros of them are, because they're off the ground and they're fully encased in plastic, you're not going to have any rodents try and get into it.
Which I have mentioned to Alyce before is my primary concern when it comes to composting, is that I don't really like the creepy crawlies.
And it is a big concern. Like, whether you're residential, whether you're out on land, whatever it is, like rodents, rats and mice, in at least Victoria is what I can speak for, are a massive problem. So I will possibly at the end just run through a few ways I think we can manage that and mitigate that. I've had extensive personal experience, unfortunately, in the matter, so I've got some ideas. So the off-ground rotating unit will get it off the ground and will keep the rodents out.
They're easy to use?
Well, so the
I imagine you probably don't have one, so maybe you don't.
I don't have one. Growing up though, my mum had one in our small courtyard and my sisters have one now. So
okay.
I have used them even though I don't have one. The reason they're rotating is because, as I said earlier, air is an important part of composting. And when you have a sealed plastic bin, you're not getting a lot of airflow in there. So by being able to rotate the unit, that creates air,
yeah,
and gyrates the mixture, for want of a better word. And actually,
I'm sure there's a better word.
You don't think that's the formal term, the gyration of the compost?
The rotation of the aeration,
the aeration, okay,
or gyration, if you like.
I think we're going to stick with gyration. Gyrate that compost is going to make it compost faster. The problem then is you have to actually get the compost out of the unit and onto your garden. And I find, like, when they're off the ground like that and you've got a small hole, effectively, trying to get it out can be a bit difficult. It's also got a limited size. So once that thing's full, it's got no space for it. So that's a factor. The other thing is, I am a really big fan of engaging natural worms. When I say natural worms, that makes it sound like introduced worm farm worms are unnatural. They are certainly not. I more mean harnessing what's already in the earth.
Yeah.
So when you compost...
Rather than buying them. Buying worms from a nursery or something.
Exactly. And I'm not even saying that from any kind of ethical consideration. I mean, it's certainly cheaper accessing the worms in the earth. And I just think it's frankly easier because you don't have to do anything. You don't have to, like, keep these babies alive. They're just there. So when you're doing the digging hole in the ground or the compost bays, the worms in the earth will find their way. Wherever they are, they will find their way to your compost bin and they will start breaking down those food scraps for you. I can guarantee it. No matter where you are, you build a compost bin, you will get worms there. It's magic, right?
The worms will come.
It's like that movie, they say, like, build it and they will come. I don't know this.
I don't know what movie it is.
Someone's going to know and they're going to be like,
let us know.
Yeah,
if you know, let us know.
Please. That'll make my quote sound so much better. That to me is like free assistance. So whenever I can, I'm going to use those worms from the earth. When you do the off-ground systems, you're not allowing the natural order of things to help you. So I find sometimes people get more problems in their compost bins when they don't have worms and nature assisting them. So you need to be a little bit more on it with the rotating units. The other thing is you've got to pay for a rotating unit, which, is an expense. I will say here, a lot of councils actually subsidise worm farms and compost bins, and different councils subsidise different ones. So
that's a great thing to look into.
It is. Whatever council you're in, go on their website and see what units. And when I say subsidise, I mean like drastically reduce the price. So as much as price is a factor for these, if your council is giving you a rebate of 80%, or 100% even, I mean, brilliant, access that stuff. And it makes sense to me because they want to divert, stuff from landfill as well. So we've got our rotating unit. We then have the standard bins on the ground. And this is probably the most common way. This is what you've got at your house right now. A big black plastic bin with a open bottom.
Yes.
I also compost like this, as well as my compost bays. And I am a fan of it because it's got the open bit at the bottom. You've got the worms coming up through the earth. You can move them around to different spots in the garden. You don't have to rotate them. They're usually a bigger size than what you're going to have on those rotating units. But they're also contained. So unlike the compost bays, they're not like a big open mess or mass. The problem with them, which is exactly what you flagged to me, is that they're a great attractant for rodents because it's so easy for a rat or a mouse to get into the compost bin.
It's an open bottom.
It's an open bottom. They dig a tiny hole. They're in there. They're having a field day. So what I do, and I would highly recommend this, is I get a piece of chicken wire or mesh just from hardware store, Bunnings even, and put that, you got to get like quite a fine gauge because obviously a mouse can get through an amazingly small hole. And you put that down on the ground, put some pegs in it to keep it in place. And then
Yeah, right, because then they can't dig up into it.
They can't dig up into it, but the worms can get up into it.
Got it.
So this to me is a very happy medium because I'm keeping the creatures out that I want out, but I'm introducing or allowing the ones I want in to get in. So I think at your place, a good option could be simply get a piece
mesh.
of wire,
Yep.
piece of mesh to go under that. And then, some big tent pegs will hold the compost bin tightly on top of that mesh. That's a brilliant option. But we've still got more. So apartment people who you mentioned earlier, Bokashi, am I saying that right? I hope so. This is like an on-bench composting setup where you're introducing microbes, because obviously you don't have any worms or
Like
soil.
on your kitchen bench or on like your balcony bench?
No,
like,
literally on your kitchen bench.
Oh, okay.
And it introduces microbes and it composts it really fast. So it moves through, because composting is a slow process, but with the addition of these Bokashi mixes, it composts down very fast. So for people in small places, apartments, I like the idea of this. I don't do it myself. You're going to have to buy the mix all the time. And again, like composting is something that we don't necessarily need to pay for, buy inputs for. So it is a bit more expensive. You're going to be composting a very small amount because, again, if you've got the unit on your kitchen bench, there's only so much food scraps you're going to get through. And again, food scraps, if you're cooking a lot from scratch, which as a gardener you probably are, plus your cardboard, your paper, that kind of thing, it's actually quite a lot that you can compost. So I think the units can be quite pricey and can be quite small, but if you like the sound of that, go for
And if
gold.
anyone's using one, let us know how it's going.
Well, definitely, I would love to hear overall which is your favourite composting system.
And you can put it on I'm just thinking about apartment living, like your herb garden, your if you have any indoor plants, can you put it on that as well?
Absolutely, and they often have a tap which you can tap off. A lot of these systems actually have a tap, including the rotating units. That, what we call tea, the compost tea that comes out of that, is incredibly nutritious. Water,
that's the good stuff.
That is the magic stuff. Water any house plants, any outdoor plants, any balcony plants with that and watch them thrive. So the worm tea or the compost tea for indoor plants is very valuable. So that's a good option. The last option is the worm farm. Now, pros of this is where you have worms doing the work, but you have them in a contained unit. These aren't worms that have come up from the ground. These are worms that you've purchased and you've introduced. They're a different type of worm to the ones that will come up during the ground. They're better at making compost than the worms that will come up from the ground, but the negative is they're a bit more sensitive and you have to actively look after them.
Am I right that there's certain things that you can put in a compost but you can't put in a worm farm?
Yes.
Okay.
Bang on. Things like citrus and onion, I'm going to whack them in my compost bays. If I was doing the dig up method, I'd do it in that compost bin, the standalone bin that you have at home. You cannot feed that stuff to your sensitive worms.
Your little delicate angels.
Your delicate angels, they don't like the onion, they don't like the garlic, they don't even like citrus. So you do have to be more picky with what you feed them. You also have to be careful with watering them, because when we've got the compost in the ground, like the standalone unit, if that dries out, those worms are just going to head back into the earth and say, stuff your compost,
something else to eat.
I'm going to find something else. When you've got a worm farm, this is a contained unit that those worms can't get in, they can't get out. If that dries out, they've got nowhere to go, they're going to die. So we do.
Oh gosh, that sounds awful.
It does, doesn't it? And conversely,
it's a worm massacre on your hands.
It is. And conversely, if you overwater it, they're going to drown. So the good thing is, though, again, because it's above ground, it's a contained unit with no holes, you're not going to get rats and mice. That's a serious plus. You're also going to get the worm tea coming out, which is beautiful for, feeding any plants, but particularly worms feeding indoor plants. You can also have this in a small space. So if you're in an apartment with a garage or a unit with a garage, you can have one of these worm farms in a garage, no problem. It's not going to smell. It's not going to create mess. It's a very clean way and an easy way of composting. So I like it from that perspective. The negative of the worm farm is a little bit more work as far as keeping the babies alive, thinking about the food you feed them. And honestly, I would say if you're a family of 4 who cook a lot from scratch, you're actually going to create more food waste than what your worms can even eat.
Okay.
So that's another factor. One more option is these like new age composting bins, where a lot of companies recently have kind of seen all these issues, especially the rodent issues, and are coming up with creative solutions. These are often quite pricey, these units, but some councils subsidise them. One I'm thinking of is the Sub Pod, and one is the Green Cone Solar Composter.
Gosh, they sound very fancy.
They do. And what they effectively are is exactly your standard bin compost that we all know, but in the bottom of it, there's a basket that you bury into the ground. And this basket stops rodents getting in because it's a whole enclosed basket setup, but allows worms in. And by having it buried into the ground, we can actually fit a lot more food scraps in it. So it's a big volume. And then the worms will come in, eat the food, take it out. So it's a whole system in one.
It does sound like the setup of getting the basket in the ground is probably more hard work. And does it do the same thing as your mesh solution with the stand-up one?
Yeah, it does. And I have a Green Cone Solar Composter. I think it's really great, but I tell you what, digging the hole, as you said, to get that thing in the ground, oh my gee, it was such a prick. So I really think, I don't see a whole host more benefits of those than simply the old standard bin with the mesh underlay. So that's my options. What's appealing to you for your place?
So I've got a really crucial question about the standalone bin. How do I get stuff out of it?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. So often they've got like a little side flap door that you can access it. I think these are shit and I don't usually use them. What I tend to do is once the compost is all broken down, I simply lift the entire bin off and I get like a massive pile of compost and then I just shovel that into the garden.
So when you're doing we talked about at the beginning of this season, clearing out your bed at the end of summer for autumn. So that could be a really good time that you do that. And just put all your compost in then.
Perfect. Yeah. You can open the little flap and get a shovel and kind of spoon a bit of it out to get it into the garden. You're not going to be able to get a huge amount out that way. So that's probably the downside of the standalone bin. Is it hard to access? Those compost bays that I have, they're really easy because you can just get a shovel in it. Those units that are off the ground are kind of easier to shovel out, but again, you're getting a trowel in there. You're not getting your big spade. So they all have their pluses and minuses, frankly.
Yeah, and I guess it sort of depends on, just if I can summarise the factors here, how much space you have to put your compost or your worm farm, what the size of your family is and how much food scraps you have. And then also what the size of your garden bed is and how much you have to feed.
Exactly. You know, I'm going to say one more thing here, thinking about your garden in particular, is the rats and mice are only attracted to the food scraps. They're not interested, say you finish up your tomato and you cut it down to compost the plant, they're not interested in eating that, right? So what I think is a really good way to do it, and this is kind of how I manage it on a bigger scale, is your standalone bin on the ground, still put your mesh down, do your garden compost, your newspaper, a lot of papers you might have in that, and then have a small worm farm that you just do food scraps that the rats can't get to. And then you can use that worm farm tea to water things, and then you can have the big compost, muck out once a year at autumn before you put in your winter crops, for example.
Yeah,
so
that's a
you
great
might
idea.
be good with the two
Some
systems.
kind of dual system.
Yeah, dual system where smaller system for the food scraps, they're going to be super attractive for rodents, and then a bigger system for the garden waste, cardboard, etc.
So the big question, is the juice worth the squeeze? This is where we look at the effort-reward ratio of today's topic. The categories are Superstar, high effort, high reward. Completing this will make you feel like an absolute rock star. Best on ground, low effort, high reward. Quick wins and fill-ins, low effort, low reward. And finally, the wooden spoon, high effort, but not much reward. So, Alyce, composting, where does it sit on the squeezy juice matrix?
I'm just such a fan of saying everything's best on ground, which I know is going to come at criticism by certain followers of ours. But, frankly, it is pretty low effort and you need a way to dispose of waste, right?
Yeah, it seems like from this discussion that the effort really is in the setup.
Yes.
And once you're set up, then... probably some of them have varying degrees of effort as you go along, like shoveling out from the standalone seems like it's a little bit more effort than just getting your tea out of a worm farm. But it seems like it's super specific to the option that you choose, but obviously high reward.
Yeah, I mean, the reward is huge. I mean, maybe it's more superstar status because there is quite a bit of effort involved.
In the setup.
In the setup, and also, as you say, like the mucking out is a bit of a job. So, but I mean, when you look at the reward to you and you look at the reward to the earth, I mean, if we had to plot that on an axis, I'm going to say it is like astronomical on the reward. But I will say the effort is on the higher side. So I'm going with superstar.
Brilliant. I am also going to go with superstar because I just think, yes, bit of effort, but the reward, huge.
Yeah.
This was obviously quite a long episode, so much to talk about. We'll probably come back to some of these specific episodes and really get more into like the nitty gritty of it, particularly once I've decided what I'm going to do at home. But fantastic insights on the options.
Stay tuned for Tess's composting adventures.
Rooting For You is hosted by Alyce and Tess. You can find us on Instagram @rootingforyoupod or email rootingforyou@alycealexandra.com.